everybody, and welcome back to Vestanland. This is episode 13, and in this episode, I build a custom medical center and add a ton of new blocks of buildings to the western side of the city. Before I get into what's going on screen, I'd first like to mention that I've been switching up some of the lighting settings, which you probably noticed. I think it looks a lot better. I think it's a lot brighter, and it makes sort of namely the watercolor, a lot more stark, which I think works really well for the city and the vibe that I'm going for. So that's one bit of housekeeping. Another thing I want to mention is I'm trying to get more into developing the backstory and the history of the city, and part of that includes developing kind of sort of a national identity for the country of Vestanland. I've come up with a flag that I think looks really nice, and I'll put a picture of it up on screen on my Discord server, which if you haven't joined that, check it out. The link is in the description and in the description of my channel. I want to get into sort of discussing the history and the backstory like I mentioned earlier. I think that's cooler if it's a sort of community-led project. So if you're interested in that, check it out. Something I've been sort of looking forward to, and I've sort of designed this series hopefully in a way that makes that a little more doable. Anyway, back to what's going on screen. Before I get over to where I'm going to place the major hospital, I'm first sort of filling out this modern neighborhood. First, I'm placing this kind of small park with a little fountain in the middle. I'm trying to sort of add green space in every neighborhood. I feel like that's both realistic and just sort of good planning. Adding sort of not super detailed, but adding some benches and some hedges, bushes and stuff like that. Adding some green space for citizens to enjoy in this area. It's an important thing to put in. You can see I'm using some of these planters, which also function as benches. Those are really a nice asset. Sort of forces people to sort of actually use the space, and also just the fact that just using the pedestrian paths through that area, you'll see more people walking through the park, which gives it a little bit of life, a little bit of vibrancy, which is nice. Now I'm kind of extending the modern buildings out to this sort of more major road. This road has the tram line and the bike lane. So sort of thinking this kind of functions as a bit of a divider between two neighborhoods, sort of the more modern development closer to the station, and then some of the older development that you'll see later in the episode on the western side of this sort of major road. You can see, I forgot to mention this earlier, but you can see that I had some of those old hospital cubes, and I ended up being able to just delete all those because I had enough capacity to the medical center, which is what I'm about to start on right now. I started out by first deleting some of these placeholder roads that I had put down in an earlier episode, and then I kind of just added a bunch of these hospital assets that I downloaded from the workshop, trying to sort of splice them together to get the vibe that I was going for. I ended up settling on putting this one, which I think is the Thai Hospital by Palm's Time. It's sort of a good generic asset. I placed that kind of on the corner, and then I add this more modern hospital wing closer to the highway and rail corridor. It kind of has a little bit of a curve to the building, which I think fits in nicely with the curve of the road, just to the south of it. My sort of goal with this medical center was to sort of make it look like it had multiple different wings that had kind of been expanded and added onto each other over the years. So you can see how this sort of more generic looking building maybe was a little bit older, and then the modern building behind it was maybe like a recent improvement to the structure. Maybe there's more like higher end or like cutting edge research going on there. And then another thing that I did was I used the vanilla high capacity hospital, which is actually a pretty nice asset. It's got a few like props on it and things like that I kind of covered up. And I sort of actually ended up switching it around. So the front of it is the back now, and I spliced in another sort of generic building to cover up some of the things that made that look unrealistic. But yeah, the textures on this vanilla hospital are actually pretty nice. I was pleasantly surprised by that. And I think these sort of three main buildings together combined to create a pretty convincing and sort of good-looking hospital complex, especially with the addition of a couple of smaller buildings spliced into the sides of them. just again add a little bit more realism and just make it a little bit more visually appealing. I started getting to the detailing here. First, I added this kind of drop-off loop. I can imagine this is where ambulances would come. If they're in a hurry, they can just come right to the front here and drop off patients. Also, just anybody could use this, I suppose. But yeah, then I also I wanted the tram line to go right in front of this hospital. I struggled a little bit with how to integrate it with the rest of the network, but eventually I figured out how to sort of add it in. I didn't want it to run in mixed traffic on the road, so I separated it out so I can kind of have more of a dedicated right of way for the tram, which I thought made more sense for this area. Down the line, this medical center area is going to be kind of a major transit hub, kind of like one stop. There's going to be a metro stop here eventually, which I don't build in this episode because I haven't really gotten to the metro system yet. But down the line, that'll be important. It'll be an important connection because I can imagine this would be a ton of people would work in this area, and it sort of is going to be the first stop on the line, starting at the central station, going out to the west. There'll be a stop here. So I sort of wanted to set up that infrastructure before I get to it later in a later episode. Now I'm adding some line work to this drop-off loop, a little bit different than some of the lines I've done in earlier areas. I just wanted it to, again, make it a little more convincing, add a little bit of realism. I changed this line close to the hospital to sort of yellow color, maybe to indicate it's, people to get out of the way, not to wait there, because this is obviously, again, where the ambulances are going to be going. So it's good for it to be clear at all times, so people can access the hospital more easily. I've been using a lot of these flat roads that don't have any curbs on them. I feel like it makes it, they're just the fact that they don't have any textures on them makes it a lot easier to customize them, and I think it ends up looking a lot better. Even if there's, I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain, I guess, but adding your own sort of custom decals and stuff like that, instead of having to rely on the textures that are built into the networks is, in my opinion, a little bit easier to deal with. This is what I mentioned, I was talking about this just earlier, but adding some of these decals to kind of beat up the pavement here. Again, this is a pretty highly trafficked area, both from vehicles and from just people walking around. So I imagine there's been a lot of repairs over the years. I wanted to reflect that by adding some cracks and some road damage. I also added a few more trees and planters around the area just to spruce it up a little bit. The next thing that I end up getting into is I start detailing sort of the area between the hospital. I guess before I get to that, I add a little bit of a fence here just to kind of delineate the edge of the hospital complex where I'm going to put some more buildings later on in the episode. And again, this is I've used this technique before of using the fences and then the concrete brushes, which you'll see in a bit, just to create a nice sharp line of concrete up to the edge, which you can't really accomplish with the surface painter. So this is a good way of getting that nice straight line with the edge of the complex. As you can see, there's a few of the vanilla parking lots that come with the vanilla hospital building. And I think having those at the back makes a lot of sense. I could see where that would be like maybe some longer term parking for people who are at the hospital for a long time, or possibly parking for doctors, again, who maybe are driving in from further out in the city. This is what I was talking about, detailing this kind of central plaza area. I can imagine this is where nurses and doctors who work at the hospital maybe would eat lunch or something like that. Also, if people are visiting patients at the hospital, this would be kind of a nice quiet place for them to sort of relax and get some fresh air. So I think it turns out pretty nice, adding some bushes and flowers along with the tables and umbrellas. Again, just kind of, I end up running a pedestrian path through this area, so there actually are going to be people going through this area, because again, this would be sort of an area where people would be able to access different wings of the hospital. And again, I sort of talked about this at the beginning, but sort of imagining that kind of more modern building is maybe like a research-focused building, whereas maybe the older one is maybe more administrative stuff, and the vanilla hospital is maybe like where actually like emergency services and like surgeries are happening, something like that anyway. Just adding a few planters and trees out to the front of this. With these generic buildings, obviously they are just kind of generic, they're kind of boring, so adding a few details like this to kind of spruce them up makes a lot of sense. I went back and added a few more texture decals just to add a little bit of life to the area. Something I've talked about it ad nauseum in the series, but adding those textures was really important. I then went back and added some more lines to a couple of the other intersections. Again, with these tram lines, adding the zigzag markings. That's something I've been doing more recently. Just kind of as a, I'm not sure I've actually seen zigzag markings like this in real life, but I'm sort of in the city. They basically just indicate a tram crossing. I think they look pretty cool, so it's something I decided to add in. I've tried to be consistent about throughout the series. Just adding all these lines, again, is important for making this area feel complete. And you'll see once I get later on in the episode, when I start placing buildings on this side, the other side of the tram tracks, having these markings in place and having these nodes all sorted out is super important for making it look like the finished product. I then finished off the area by adding some bollards. Again, there's probably a lot of car traffic coming in and out, so I didn't want cars flying into the hospital. That wouldn't be good for a lot of reasons. I also ended up connecting the tram track sort of to the rest of the network with the idea of I don't do it on camera, but I added another tram line just to this area to connect this hospital complex with the rest of the city. And then I didn't do a ton of detailing on this back area. I imagine this is like sort of a service point for the hospital, and again, it's where maybe a lot of parking is for longer term parking needs for people working at the hospital and whatnot. Now that I'm done with the hospital complex, I'm sort of moving on to what is basically the second half of the episode, just filling out this whole area north and east of the hospital with some more buildings. I started out by placing some modern apartments right on this sort of other side of the fence that I placed down earlier. I imagine this is maybe temporary housing for people visiting the hospital, or maybe there's like medical students that would live in this area. That's kind of my tentative thought process for what's going on there. And then for the rest of this kind of main boulevard, I kind of wanted this to serve, this row of blocks to serve as a transition between more modern housing and some of the older, like old town style buildings that I've placed down on the other side of the main station. To do that, I downloaded a bunch of new modern Dutch mid-rise housing buildings, which are really nice, and they kind of do a good job of easing that transition between the modern and older style buildings. As you can see, this block here that I just did is an example of adding the modern buildings on the side fronting the main avenue, and then adding some more older style buildings that are kind of facing the more neighborhood streets. Yeah, these modern Dutch buildings are really nice. They're generic enough. I mean, the kind of roof line is pretty distinctive of a Dutch building, but I think they're simple enough that it works for a more generic purpose, like I'm using them for here. You can see the bike lane and the tram road right there. You can see how there's people walking there already, and that's going to be a major thoroughfare for this region. And I'll get to doing some detailing on that a little bit later on. But before I do that, again, this area is a little bit, it sort of has some of the same types of buildings as the true old town, but it's a little bit newer, and you'll sort of see that reflected in how the blocks are a little bit more regular, and they're sort of more squared off from each other, which again makes it a little bit easier to place down the building, so I don't have to worry about a ton of the awkward corners and stuff. Anyway, this is the detailing of this little avenue type thing that I was mentioning earlier. I started off by actually going around and detailing this tram stop. I placed this tram stop down a while ago, but it just sort of been blank, and now I actually gave it the care it deserved. And using intersection marking tool with the props, it's kind of a new update, I think, to the mod, where you can add lines that are props. That makes it so much easier to do this type of detailing, and allows you to do things a lot more consistently, which is really nice. And yeah, this is again, I've talked about using the same kind of style of detailing for all the different transit stops in the city. I think that's really useful for tying everything together. I'm using the same like new platform series of props, which I use on the central station, but also the tram stops that I've detailed so far. So I use those same things on this station, again, to sort of add some of that consistency. And then in front of the buildings, between the buildings and the bike lane, I added some bike parking props, which again is another important thing, I think, for just the realism of the city. I want this to be a bikeable place, and obviously I'm placing down a lot of bike infrastructure, but it kind of doesn't really make sense if there aren't, visually anyway, places for people to park their bikes. And that's what I'm adding in here, and I think that adds a lot. It's a pretty simple way of detailing a building like that, and it's also pretty realistic. So yeah, it's good on a couple different levels. Now I'm getting over to placing down a few more buildings. Again, I placed down these roads earlier just kind of as a placeholder to kind of get an idea of what I was going to be doing in the future. But now I'm sort of adjusting them so they're a little bit more squared off. Again, that kind of makes things easier for me. But I don't want it to completely sound like a cop-out, because my thought process is that, again, this is sort of a newer developed area, so there's a little bit more consistency in how the buildings are laid out. And again, that makes them sort of more rectangular in terms of the shape of the different blocks. I also am adding a lot of these sort of filler buildings between the blocks, because at least to try to make them look realistic, I had to have something to fill the space, but I also didn't want to like just place down trees, so I added a few blocks or not blocks, but new buildings, just to sort of make the roof lines look a little more interesting. This area right here, where I'm fiddling around with this procedural object building to fit into this kind of angled piece of the tram network, this is where I'm going to place down a tram stop, which is going to again serve the medical center and this neighborhood. You can see I've sort of copied over the detailing from the tram stop I did earlier. Again, goes back to the sort of idea of adding the consistency that I was talking about. But then I am placing down some cobblestone decals, and again, these are the same ones I used on the train, Central train station plaza area. Again, I'm thinking this was probably a like government-led project to sort of beautify and develop this area, so it makes sense they would use a consistent sort of decoration scheme of sorts. Anyway, I'm adding these cobblestone plazas, which I think look really nice, and then adding curbs to the edge of them. But I don't know, that's not necessarily even realism, but it just sort of makes it look a little more plausible, in the sense that it's kind of marked the plaza different from the sidewalk. Doesn't have any practical effect, but I think it looks a little bit better, which is good. I'm sort of extending this. I end up adding these cobblestone to these kind of two blocks between the buildings and the tram tracks and the hospital. And this is the type of thing where I'm not going to add this level of detail to like every part of the city, even though in a real city maybe that would be, obviously that's how it would work. But I'm sort of just doing this level of detailing on these kind of highly visible areas that are more important for cinematic purposes. Yeah, so I think that's my basic mindset for places like this. I'm also adding a few of these shop front buildings, which I've talked about in earlier episodes. They're super useful for creating spaces like this. Adding a few benches, a few of these sort of food vendor kiosks in these plaza areas. Again, it's really helpful for creating a more realistic looking setting for this area. You can see the tram track continues on to sort of the left of the screen. Yeah, this cinematic just really shows the level of increased development that I've been able to get through so far. But I was mentioning, you might be able to sort of see, if you look closely enough, that there's a metro station placeholder building there. You can see that underground station will be really important for connecting up this medical center with the rest of the city. But again, that's going to be well into the future once I get the metro system up and running again, which will be more of it'll be an episode into itself. So yeah, keep an eye out for that down the line. Next thing I move on is sort of adding some more modern development. Again, I'm thinking this was probably maybe like a post-industrial area, so it makes sense to have more modern buildings in this kind of awkward piece of land between the highway and the more established neighborhood. this is more similar to more recent episodes where I built the neighborhood next to the station, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. I would like to take the chance to say thank you to you guys for watching the video. If you're enjoying it so far and you want to follow along with the series, consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a like. I really appreciate it, and it helps more people get involved with the series, which is really cool. I mentioned it earlier, but I have a Discord server, which if you're interested in that, that'll be linked in the description. Also, give my Instagram a follow if you want more regular photo updates of the city and stuff I'm working on. But yeah, thanks again for watching, and I'll talk a little bit now about what I'm doing on screen. Again, adding some planters and trees to this area, and adding more of these modern Dutch style mid-rise buildings to this little area. Again, this is pretty high density residential building here. There's not a ton of like commercial buildings or anything like that necessarily. I'm sort of thinking this is more of a again, just a high density kind of like quiet residential neighborhood, and that kind of awkward piece of land. But then I decided to go back and fill out more of this old style neighborhood, again adding a lot of the same buildings I've been using in earlier episodes, but this time also using some of these French apartment blocks, which I believe are by Seabud on the workshop. They're again super useful, again because they are really compatible with PO, and they kind of fill into a lot of different, you can fill them into a lot of different awkward shapes, which is really useful. This little area right here, this building, I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I think it looks pretty cool. Using this it's this really awkward spot where I kind of connected the tram line up to the rest of the network, but then also had the major road coming in sort of at a diagonal from the highway. So I added this, I placed the same building down twice, and then added some procedural object windows to the side of it to kind of make it look a little bit more realistic. I'm not sure how realistic it really is, but I think it looks all right, so I think I'm gonna keep it the way it is. Now I'm sort of getting into an area where there's a little bit of a height difference. So far I've been really primarily working on only flat land, so that little area where it sort of travels up the hill is going to be a little bit of a challenge going forward, but that's sort of for future episodes down the line. The last sort of major thing I do in this episode is I add this little plaza to the west of the hospital with a couple of food trucks and other vendors, stuff like that. I can imagine that this would be a popular spot for people working at the hospital to get lunch, come outside, get a bite to eat, stuff like that. And I can imagine this is a pretty like high demand area. If you're someone running a food truck, this is probably like the place to be, because there's always a ton of people around. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting little thing that I added, because I don't want all these blocks to just be buildings. I want there to be some sort of public space for people to enjoy. Anyway, this is the last thing of the episode, so I'd like to again take the time to thank you guys for watching. Please give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel if you're interested in following along with the series, and yeah, leave comments down below for anything you'd like to see in the future. Check out the Instagram and Discord links, which will be in the description. Again, thanks so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you guys in the next video.